Contested history. How is a reconstruction viewed? Today we're going to talk about the importance of history and its historians. We're going to explain to you the Dunning School of Thought. Next, we're going to look at two different people, Webb Dubois and Bernard Weisberg. And then we're going to talk about how scholars today view the Reconstruction era.
History gives us an insight into ways society has changed and developed over time. It can explain why certain events happened and how they were handled. It shows what influence different events or people had and how they shaped our society. It serves evidence for how society functions and how this has changed over the course of time. We can look at past events and understand the present. If we look at the Civil War and its causes, we can understand more of why the Reconstruction was so important. If we look at past events, it enables us to understand not only our society, but also other cultures. It shows us what made different cultures behave other than ours and what caused this. It shows the struggles cultures had in the past and how people reacted to them, giving us clues on why cultures today have different values and ideals. By this, we can gather a better awareness and understanding of cultures and their origin. History affects us in many different ways. Not only did it shape our society and how we live today, it also affects our choices and behavior, even if we're not aware of it. Depending on what culture we live in, it changes our moral understanding and what we believe in. It influences how we view different events and react to things, what we think is right or wrong. Thereby, it changes our behavior towards other people. This is caused by how the society we live in has developed and was shaped by different events. Many say history is supposed to teach us about the past mistakes so we won't repeat them. Regardless of how much this is true, by looking at how people reacted to certain things in the past, we can to a certain degree estimate on how they will react in the future. This counts for our personal lives as well as for the events that affect our society. History is studied by historians. But what do historians actually do? Historians interpret history. They come up with new perspectives and questions, and new ways of looking at the past. They have to check different sources on accuracy and figure out whether a source is biased, to come up with different theories on certain events and try to prove them with historical evidence. By finding new perspectives, we get a different insight into history and how things actually happened. This explains why certain events of history are told differently over time. Our view on certain events can change when we find new sources or find out that other sources are incorrect or biased, thereby changing how history is told. Now, a short summary on why history is important. History makes us able to understand how past events shape the present and our society. It gives us an insight into different cultures and their origin, giving us a better understanding of them. It can also explain our behavior and beliefs as well as many of the choices we make. By studying history, we are also able to make reasonable predictions for the future by looking at events that happened in the past and how people reacted to them.
One of the ways that Reconstruction was viewed in history was by the South, known as the Dunning School of Thought. William Archibald Dunning, which you can see on the left, was a Southern historian who came from a very rich family who were previous slave owners. Many Southern historians studied under him and then were appointed to important positions. They then spread the historiographical school of thought called the Dunning School. It's a very traditional and conservative view of Reconstruction. It saw Reconstruction as the lowest point in American history. At first, they said it didn't have anything to do with race and that it was exclusively about the punishment towards the South. This was because they saw as they saw African American as so little that they couldn't even be a part of the history of the United States. They, of course, also denied that the Civil War was anything about slavery. The North was said to only come to the South for money, and these Northerners were called carpetbaggers, and they were said to exploit the South for their resources while they were vulnerable during Reconstruction. It was also seen as a low point because African Americans were in politics and were ruining the South. They were said to be uneducated, uncooperative, and like children, and this was just generally seen as that they made bad policies and that then the South was ruined. Because of this, the KKK, who helped restore the South to home rule, which was basically white supremacy, were then seen as the heroes during Reconstruction and by the Dunning School. The historians were a lot less open-minded and very racist. E.B. Du Bois meant that the texts that they wrote were just blatant racism. Not to mention, many of the historians were direct descendants of slave owners and tried to justify their families' actions. A consequence of the story told by the Dunning School historians were that the schools and parents would listen to these versions and believe what they said. The children then thought that Reconstruction was horrific, and they became very racist, and the idea of an equal democracy faded from the public, and it became nearly impossible for African Americans to gain equality. They also, of course, portrayed the KKK as the heroes, which meant that the KKK just grew in the South during this time after Reconstruction. The historian Eric Fauner also said that the Dunning School was an explanation and justification as to why they were allowed to take away the rights of the African Americans. For example, they said African Americans couldn't do politics, so they then said African Americans shouldn't vote, and they then pointed to Reconstruction as a way to prove their point. And this basically helped them justify and explain all of the Jim Crow laws. And also it meant that many thought that these were necessary because they believed in the Dunning school of thought.
W.E.B. Du Bois was born in 1868 and died in 1963. He was born in Massachusetts 3 years after the end of slavery and grew up in a tolerant and integrated community, which led to him having different views in comparison to other historians. He was a sociologist, historian, and civil rights activist, as well as the first impactful historian who was against the Dunning School. Dr. Du Bois was interested in knowing what the former slaves thought about Reconstruction. So he traveled to Tennessee's countryside and asked men and women who were former slaves what they thought about Reconstruction. He also wanted to know what their spirituals and prayers were about. And through these discussions, he realized how good Reconstruction was. He saw the Reconstruction as being an unfulfilled promise and potential because the rights which the African Americans finally received were taken away a few years later. As he wrote in The Black Reconstruction, which is one of his books, the true unending tragedy is that people don't see its significance. He understood that Reconstruction changed the lives of the African Americans in a better way and wasn't something that was accomplished fast. It needed time, so it would be wrong to assess Reconstruction as a failure. As said, you must see the Reconstruction as a one act in series of dramas of democracy. Bernard Wiesberger was born in 1922 in New York and lives today in Evanston, Illinois. He is a well-known teacher and author of American history. In 1959, he called the Reconstruction the dark and bloody ground of American historiography.
Because the Reconstruction is so contentious, and it has been such a long way to reach what they had reached in the Reconstruction. But it didn't take long time for the Southerners, who were ashamed of the Reconstruction, to put an end to it. Among them was especially the Ku Klux Klan very active, in which way it all in some kind went back to how it was before the Civil War. They introduced the black codes and Jim Crow laws, which took all the rights, for example the right to vote, from African Americans.
Moving on to how Reconstruction is viewed today. Most historians today would of course not agree with the old views on Reconstruction. People mostly see the importance of Reconstruction. As Amira already mentioned, one historian named Timothy P. McCartney said, "We need to think about Reconstruction as one act in a series of dramas of democracy. It wasn't a failure, but a step in the right direction." But there are still big parts of the public who aren't informed good enough about this area and still believes in the old views. The problem is that for such a long time the misinformation was represented everywhere. In the television, in the schools, by the politicians. So a lot of people who feels threatened or finds African American claim on American society still too radical, they still hold on to that old thought that Anne-Sophie talked about earlier and the memory of it. For such a long time it was portrayed in pop culture and still is in some forms. We talked about it regarding Gone with the Wind, which is still quite a famous movie. It sympathizes with the South and gives a not quite correct picture of what actually happened. At the end, we want to go back to our title, Contested History. Why is a Reconstruction area viewed as contested? First, we need to know what does contested even mean. Something that's contested means something that's argued over or questioned. It's opposing something as mistaken or wrong. And that's exactly what happened with the history of Reconstruction. First, you had this one view about it, for us, the old view, which was represented everywhere. And then people started opposing to this view and they didn't agree with it. They questioned the history of Reconstruction and interpreted their own perspective on it. And suddenly, the history of Reconstruction looked quite differently. And still, there are a lot of different views on this area, whether it was a failure or not, for example. In the end, it's all about which side you're on. If it was the white Southern people, the history could be viewed different than if it was the African American one sympathized with. Now we have some questions for you. First of all, do you think we learn from past mistakes made in history? And the second question, should the North have intervened to stop the spread of the Dunning School of thought? What do you think?